Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What is on My Wrist, we are talking about a Rolex Explorer reference 1016 with a Mark I dial from 1966. This is an exceptionally cool example because this is what we would call a fat font or marshmallow lume example, which is a variant in the Mark I dial range. So we had a really nice version of this come into the Craft and Tailored shop. I wanted to talk a little bit about matte dial 1016s and also highlight this example because you don't see the fat lume variant as much, and it's kind of a unique variant, and figured would make a good basis of comparison for the entire reference range. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Rolex Explorer and the 1016. It's no secret that the Rolex Explorer and more specifically the Rolex Explorer 1s have kind of a tie into Mount Everest. And what's interesting is that the story of the Explorer began when references 6098 and 6150, which house the caliber A296, were utilized by adventurers and mountaineers in the beginning of the 1950s. More specifically, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay when they reached the summit of Mount Everest in 1953. So what's interesting is that obviously these watches that they wore weren't exactly like Explorers that we know today, but they were very similar to, you know, kind of the Explorer 1 variant. And Rolex being a super marketing company back then, they were leveraging this kind of groundbreaking expedition and this monumentous event to promote a watch and the idea and the lifestyle behind having a watch that was the adventurer's watch. So that's ultimately kind of where the 1016 falls into the Rolex sport watch lineup. The other thing that's kind of interesting about 1016s and Rolex Explorer 1s is that, you know, they are a sports watch, but they're not a sports watch in the stereotypical sense of being, a watch that has a bezel or complications or is oversized or over ruggedized. The 1016 and the Explorer 1s in general are, oyster cases. They're commonly on an oyster bracelet. And they're a watch that really is time only. The main difference is that, the Explorer 1 has kind of, I would say, more of like a hybrid, dial in the sense that you've got the Submariner style hands and this triangle at the 12 o'clock position, and you've got this matte dial in the later matte 1016 references like this one that we're featuring here in this episode. But what's interesting is that you kind of have that, again, that kind of crossover between an Oyster Perpetual dress watch and then kind of a dial hand layout that you would see more commonly in a Submariner. So it's kind of, again, I think a sports watch in a sense, but it's also kind of, I would say, a little bit more of a hybrid, being that it doesn't have an outer rotating bezel, it doesn't have any kind of complications. It's a superlative chronometer, so it's a cost graded watch, but it's a little bit more simple, which I think is one of the reasons why I really like Explorer 1s as a whole, and also why I think Explorer 1s have taken on a bit of a cult-like following in I would say the past 10 or 15 years. It was a watch that kind of was really in the same category as almost like, an Oyster Perpetual, or maybe even like the Datejust kind of steel watches. It's, 36 millimeter case, Oyster, or in some cases Jubilee bracelet, kind of a no frills watch. But the fact that it does have this high contrast, high visibility dial and kind of is a bit of a crossover is, I think, what makes them worthy of collecting, and why there's also that cult-like following and a heightened interest level around the 1016s, and more specifically in the matte dial range, which is really cool. So let's talk a little bit about the introduction of the matte dial. So in 1966, Rolex transitioned dials in the reference 1016. So we went from a glossy gilt dial to a matte dial in 1966. And then in around 1989, 1990, we see the introduction of the 14270, which is really cool because if you think about it, the 1016 was the last real sport watch to retain a matte dial all the way up until 1990, which obviously other sport models like the Submariners and Daytonas and everything else had a dial transition that happened much earlier. So the 1016 really retained that kind of classic iconic matte sports dial the longest until really, again, the introduction of the 14270. There are a bunch of different dial variants for, the 1016 in the matte dial range. There's actually 6 dial variants, dial number 6 being a service dial. So that would be like a matte Luminova service dial. But Mark 1 through 5 are tritium dials that all possess different and little tiny characteristics. What's interesting about this specific variant being that it's a fat font lume, if you look closely at the lume, especially kind of like at the 9 and the 6 and the 3, you'll see that the lume is kind of like cloudy or almost like marshmallowy or like puffy, as opposed to the other variants within this same range, which is the Mark 1, which has a little bit more of an organized, less kind of puffy, more thin font characteristic. So this is a Mark 1, and the way that you tell a Mark 1 from, let's say, the Mark 2 through 5 is that basically the coronet, so the Rolex crown, looks like a frog foot. So Mark 1 1016s, there are a couple of slight variances, and this being a puffy or marshmallow lume version of a Mark 1 is one of those variants. There's all kinds of nicknames, I know, but I think it helps, retain some of this information, and also, allows us as collectors and as aficionados within the subject to kind of separate some of these different designations. So the fat lume or marshmallow lume really exists within the 1.5 million to 1.7 million serial range for the 1016s. And what's interesting also about that is the Mark 1 serial range really kind of exists between like 1.5 to 3.5 million. So it was a dial variant that existed in the Mark 1 range for a while, from again 1.5 to about 3.5 is kind of the general rule of thumb for a Mark 1 dial. And we can get into all the other dial variants and all that stuff for 1016s, but I just kind of wanted to highlight this being an interesting variant of a Mark 1, but also kind of just talk about this specific example to provide a little bit more history behind matte dial 1016s. And also, I really like this one. I think that like big, broad kind of font with the fat font or marshmallow font is interesting, and it kind of stands out and jumps out while on the wrist. So really awesome watch. I personally like 1016s. It was a watch that I really didn't get into until later into my collecting. I kind of just was like, it's a matte dial Oyster Perpetual, right? Like why I want subs, I want Daytonas, I want that kind of stuff. But what's cool about this watch is that, I think it kind of transitions between a dress watch and a sports watch. It's something that is nice. It can kind of fit under the sleeve of a shirt, maybe not one that is reminiscent of Jack Sparrow. But what I'm saying is that the case profile is nice and it's kind of sleek. It could fit under like the shirt cuff really nicely. It's steel. I like them on both Oyster and Jubilee bracelets, but it's kind of a watch that can really, I guess, kind of transcend into both worlds of being dress and formal and also in extremely sporty. And so that's kind of why I started maybe to pay attention to 1016s in my later collecting, was because you kind of have all the things that I like about matte dial sport watches and Submariners and that kind of stuff, a 369 dial, right? That's really cool. But also you have it in an Oyster case and on bracelet formats that are a little bit more, I guess, utilitarian and kind of flexible. A sub can kind of be bulky, a Daytona can kind of be like too sporty, right? The Explorer 1 kind of, I guess it fits right there in the middle, which is really cool. This specific example is from 1966. It's a 1.7 million serial. Has a really nice kind of creamy lume coloration. Lume and coloration of lume can vary from piece to piece. It's just kind of age and history and all that kind of stuff, which dictates what the lume I think is ultimately gonna look like. But overall, the watch has a really nice fat case, Oyster bracelet, which is really, really nice. Big cornet. The bracelet is also from 69, so it's an era correct bracelet, and overall the watch is in just really nice condition. So I figured it was worthy of some discussion and definitely some time on the wrist. So tech specs, you guys are asking for sizing and things like that. I think that's a great idea. So we'll start providing that in the videos as we do them. The watch measures 36 millimeters across and it has 20 millimeter lugs. Not the thickest watch. I like them on both bracelets, and I think this is a watch that is also super handsome on a strap. So you can get fun with like suedes and some kind of like more rugged straps. I like wearing 1016s on straps. So it's got a Cal 1570 movement in it, so it wears pretty thin. The 1570 is superlative rated movement, superlative chronometer, officially certified. It is a watch that I think possessed kind of a scientific rating as well. I think that was kind of the allure behind the 1016 as well, as it was a watch that could be used for expeditions and things like that. It was a very precise timekeeping instrument. But again, waterproof, screw down twin lock crown. In any case, yeah, let us know if we missed anything. Let us know what you guys would like to see next. And as always, guys, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're not doing so already, follow us on Instagram @CraftandTailored. And if you've got watch questions, we are here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailored.com. I'll provide a link in the description below so that you guys can check this piece out. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.